Hello, I'm Dale Matchek, Chairman of the Econ program at Northwood University, and I am happy to introduce to you somebody who needs no introduction to those of you associated with the university, Alex Tokarev, Professor of Economics here. Alex is not going to join us live for the presentation, but he should be able to join us for the Q&A. For those of you who tuned in who were expecting to see Ryan Anderson at this point, Ryan Anderson's presentation has been scheduled for 2:30. So if you come back at 2:30, Ryan will be here. A little bit about Alex. First of all, I want to say that Alex has kind of two approaches to his subject matter. And as we've seen through some of our presenters, some of them approach their topic from an academic perspective, kind of a detached intellectual curiosity, because their training as academics causes them to do that. And some of them have approached it with more conviction, based on what they know by experience. And I think Alex is a kind of combination of these two things. He's got his academic temperament, his Ph.D. from the University of Illinois at Carbondale. Also, he's got that lived experience, having grown up in a communist society, having been indoctrinated into the Marxist ideology. And because he has that lived experience and that academic temperament, he brings a unique perspective to the issues that we're talking about this weekend. So I'm going to invite you to listen to the recorded presentations, and then we'll have Professor Tokarev on here later to answer your questions.
Classical liberalism stands on these self-evident truths: that all people are created equal in our right to life, that our right to liberty is not subject to arbitrary restrictions, that we can acquire property rights only through voluntary means, that rights are meaningless and virtue is impossible without free choices, that our natural rights are unalienable and thus not determined by majority rule, that the government is a dangerous tool to be used solely for protecting our rights, that any government exceeding its proper specifically delegated functions is tyrannical, that the free market is the most progressive arrangement for economic human interactions, that any forced redistribution of wealth is unconstitutional and breeds poverty and immorality, that personal liberty and our constitutional republic are only compatible with private enterprise. The 6 pillars of classical liberalism are unalienable rights, personal responsibility, moral absolutes, the rule of law, free enterprise, and earned success. Classical liberals support the right of private owners to determine the rules on their property, unbiased enforcement of voluntary contracts, equal treatment under the law, the right to free speech in all public spaces, the right of all consumers to free choices, freedom to work without political obstacles, and applying the Constitution as it was written. They oppose individual and political acts of aggression, equalizing outcomes, speech codes, identity politics, government monopolies, mandatory unionization, and diversity quotas. Classical liberalism rejects socialism and cronyism as obstacles to human flourishing and promotes capitalism as the wellspring of human progress. What is the classical liberal concept of human rights? Their source, nature, and implications. God is the source of our rights. They are not privileges granted by government acts. There are no group rights. All human beings are endowed by their creator with the same individual rights. The law cannot create or take away rights. It either defends or violates them. All rights are negative. We have the right not to be harmed, murdered, enslaved, or robbed. There are no positive rights to receive free goods and services. The only proper laws are also negative. thou shalt not. The right of a citizen to bear arms in defense of himself and his property is absolute. A law cannot be passed to infringe upon or impair the right to bear arms, because it is above the law and independent of the legislative power. Any government exceeding its rights enforcement duties is illegitimate and must be reformed or replaced. Any negative law that violates rights and all positive laws are a perversion of justice and must be resisted and abolished. There are only two ways to interact with people: force or freedom. It's either coercion or cooperation. When deciding how to use the tool we call the government, we have to ask ourselves, is it better to depend on a central plan or to rely on individual initiative? Must we treat citizens as children who need motherly care from the cradle to the grave? Or shall we recognize people as autonomous creatures with unalienable rights and personal responsibilities? One system comes from the barrel of a gun. The other appears peacefully and organically from social interactions and the market process. The first one has many names, such as Marxism, fascism, Nazism. Let's stick with socialism and put some democratic lipstick on its ugly face. Its alternative is known as capitalism. Socialism sucks. You want proof? See how people vote with their feet. Did West Berlin build a wall to stop people from moving to the socialist part of Germany? How many Floridians build rafts and sail to Cuba's free healthcare system? Do South Koreans try to escape north to get free education? Why isn't the Central American migrant caravan going to Venezuela in search of a better life? Because socialism is a humanitarian disaster in practice. More fundamentally, it's an evil idea. Socialism, noted Churchill, is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. It always fails because it's not designed for human beings. Socialism is incompatible with human nature and rejects human rights. The followers of this dark ideology do not even understand what human rights are. To be a socialist, you must allow contradictory ideas to dance in your head. Let me demonstrate. Examine the proposals of any socialist politician. They profess to stand for liberty. Given the record of socialism in the previous century, that sounds atrocious, but here is the real problem. In the same breath as they denounce slavery, socialists declare food, housing, education, and healthcare to be human rights. Unless they expect Santa Claus to deliver those goodies, my so-called right to food must enslave a farmer or a chef, just as your right to healthcare enslaves a doctor or a nurse. Our real rights are all negative. You don't have a legitimate claim on the fruits of someone else's labor because you are not his master. You have the right not to be murdered. My son has the right not to be drafted in the army. I have the right not to be plundered, even if the thief works for the IRS. Hence, the proper law is also negative. Thou shalt not murder, enslave, or steal. Capitalism follows naturally from a self-evident truth. Because you own yourself, you own the fruits of your time and labor. Your property is the product of your life and liberty. Capitalism is private property and the freedom to use it. It gives us what we want. Because people are not perfect or perfectible, the outcomes of capitalism can never match anyone's expectations of perfection. It's not an ideal system. It's just better than any alternative. Every socialistic experiment in history is different because it's conducted by unique individuals under specific circumstances. There are three types of socialism based on the way people implement that economic system: utopian, authoritarian, and democratic. The first one is voluntary, typically established in small rural communes. The second one may come from the barrel of a gun, as it happened with Lenin, but Mussolini and Hitler were elected. Democratic socialism's guns show up in the form of laws after the votes are cast. Few public school graduates know that people tried socialism in America on several occasions, always with disastrous results. 2/3 of the first British colonists died in 1607 within 6 months of arriving in Jamestown. 2 years later, 500 new recruits arrived in fertile Virginia. Almost 90% of them starved within 6 months. The colonists had no property in the fruits of their labor. A new governor came 2 years later and tried capitalism. The land was privatized and the colony thrived. Having learned nothing from the socialist failure and capitalism's success in Jamestown, the Pilgrims repeated the mistake in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. They tried communal ownership in the vain hope that it would foster goodwill and brotherhood. Working collectively and sharing the food according to need produced famine. The governor saw the folly of socialism, and every family established dominion over separate plots of land. Capitalism saved Plymouth. 2 centuries later, a British intellectual and successful capitalist tries his socialist utopia in New Harmony, Indiana. Within a few years, Owen's idealistic followers run into the ground the economy of a previously prospering town. Setting an example for all future socialist leaders, he blames the people as unfit for the socialist ideal. His son is more perceptive or honest. Socialism plunders the valuable members, retaining only the improvident, unskilled, and vicious. In the following century, socialism gets tested on a grand scale, revealing not only its inherent inefficiencies, but also its cannibalistic savagery. Wilson's decision to spill American blood in the European War leads to a disastrous peace and sponsors the rise of several authoritarian statist collectivistic regimes. As ideological cousins, Marxism, fascism, and Nazism have no respect for human rights. Individuality must die at the socialist altar. Hitler and Stalin perpetrate genocide against their own citizens, start World War II as allies, then engage in fratricidal conflict. Once again, America tips the scales against Germany. After 1945, the socialist pandemic takes more victims than the war itself. Authoritarian socialism is imposed in Eastern Europe and China, while democratic socialism infects Britain and its former empire. Collectivization starves 50 million Chinese. Nationalization brings the first industrial superpower to its knees. After Mao's death, privatization saves China's agriculture and fuels its manufacturing sector. Capitalism restores the British economy in the 1980s. By the end of the decade, socialism collapses all over the planet. Freer markets restore the dignity of billions of people previously oppressed by their political elites and petty bureaucrats. From Hong Kong to Mumbai, from New Zealand to Estonia, from Chile to Botswana, everywhere, every time, capitalism beats socialism hands down. We live in a world of scarcity. Human desires exceed our ability to satisfy them. We must make choices. Each decision is costly. To get one wish fulfilled, we give up another. Everything is a trade-off. All economic goods have opportunity costs. No free lunch. Unless we cooperate with many individuals, our existence will be short and miserable. The question then is, how do we coordinate our individual plans as producers and consumers? No economic actor can ever know what, how, and for whom to produce without information available to others. Socialism attempts to centralize the decision-making in the hands of state planners. Capitalism leaves all individuals free to do the planning at a local level. Socialism fails because it cannot obtain, make sense of, or act upon the relevant data about resources and needs. Capitalism works because it has a way of utilizing dispersed knowledge. For a rational economic order to emerge, billions of individual actions must be coordinated efficiently. How do we account for all opportunity costs? How do we compare the benefits of using all resources in alternative ways for the satisfaction of diverse wants? Knowledge about all this is scattered in billions of human minds. It can only be pooled and communicated to everyone when market prices emerge from free trades of private property owners. As Friedman pointed out, the prices that people are willing to pay for products determines what's produced. The prices that have to be paid for raw materials, for the wages of labor, and so on, determine the cheapest way to produce these things. The same prices, the wages of labor, the interest on capital, and so on, determine how much each person has to spend on the market. The market doesn't care about your race or sex. It rewards you based on merit. Freedom works better than force. Free enterprise vastly outperforms socialism, communal ownership, fascism, state control of private property, and cronyism, the intercourse of big government with big business and big labor. Capitalism helps private property owners to find their mistakes and creates the incentives to correct them. Free markets provide feedback through profits and losses, teaching us how to better allocate resources in the service of human needs. Capitalism diffuses power among market participants. Socialism concentrates it in a party elite. Creation of wealth is unlimited. Political power is finite. We can have 10 times as many millionaires in America, and that could make the rest of us better off. Entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs become billionaires by improving the lives of billions of people. But when your government grows, it does so at the expense of your human rights and personal freedoms. Market transactions are a win-win. Political actions involve winners, predators, and losers, victims. The free market breaks the system of privilege and cronyism. Big businesses are at the mercy of consumers. Ask Pan Am and Blockbuster. Governments force us to pay for things we may hate, war or abortion. Entrepreneurs compete for our money. Socialism enslaves everyone. Democracy enslaves the minority. Capitalism secures your freedom to choose. Choose wisely. Here is a short list of the most common myths and misconceptions about capitalism. It's bad for the poor, bad for the environment, bad for our future, bad for our character, and bad for our freedom. The first claim is clearly absurd. Anyone can find out the truth by examining changes in global poverty rates from the past 250 years. Or you could look at the correlation between poverty and economic freedom for over 170 countries. The lesson is clear. Capitalism rules. Before the rise of the free enterprise system in England, 6 of your 8 children would die as infants and toddlers. When Marx became a socialist, capitalism had already flipped that number. At the birth of America, 9 out of 10 people on our planet lived in poverty. Capitalism flipped the number, reducing poverty to 10%. According to a United Nations report, 2 billion people rose out of extreme poverty in just 25 years after the collapse of socialism in 1989. Today, if you are poor in the most capitalist economies in the world, you are 10 times better off than being poor in the most socialistic countries. Free markets unleash the entrepreneurial potential of ordinary people, generating rising standards of living and decreased need for children to work. Capitalism brought dramatic increases in life expectancy and better education. The success of free enterprise gave the masses leisure time and made us environmentalists. Wealthy people demand better environmental quality, so private entrepreneurs invest profitably in greener technologies. Capitalism has made us rich, so we are now more patient. You cannot wait on an empty stomach. Property rights promote sustainability, incentivizing long-term planning. Owners are aware that assets are worth more now if their future value is improved. When the resources belong to you, your self-interest demands that you conserve them. Capitalism provides the freedom to pursue what you believe is good for you and also what's right for your community. Markets create incentives to be more virtuous and to serve others. Capitalism does not run on greed. Selfishness manifests in all systems. Human nature does not change. Capitalism civilizes greed and uses it for good. It offers financial rewards to identify the sufferings of others and alleviate them. Whatever the motive, that's real compassion in practice. In a free market economy, it pays to act in a decent and caring manner. Being trustworthy and prudent is noticed and rewarded by customers and employers. The incentive to practice such virtues produces better individuals and societies. Capitalism enables charity through wealth creation. Successful entrepreneurs and common men engage in humanitarianism on a scale never seen before. Capitalism encourages everyone to cooperate, improving social ties and harmony. Capitalism is freedom. We pursue our ends without coercion. Other economic systems rely on violence. Most importantly, for those who advocate for alternative arrangements, capitalism leaves you free to behave socialistically. Bernie is allowed to put his money where his mouth is and share his millions with the poor. Socialism, however, Marxist, fascist, or democratic, does not return the favor. It uses guns to force itself on all of us. Capitalism rocks. Aristotle knew that 2,000 years before it started producing its magnificent fruits. The most brilliant ancient philosopher gave us 5 arguments in support of private ownership: economic, sociological, anthropological, historical, and moral. Let's start with the definition. Capitalism is the freedom of ordinary individuals to exercise dominion over external things in exclusion of other people. It recognizes our unalienable human right to acquire property in land and capital. Unlike socialism, defined as communal ownership of the means of production, capitalism creates the necessary incentives for good stewardship. Wastefulness, pollution, environmental degradation, and resource depletion are endemic to socialistic societies, where private property rights over the productive resources are not recognized. When the land is owned collectively and governments control the commanding heights of the economy, the natural outcome is the tragedy of the commons. Compared to socialism, capitalism results in higher efficiency and superior productivity. Thus, socialism leads to stagnation and poverty, while capitalism generates economic and social progress. When many unrelated people share ownership in valuable resources, everyone tries to extract as much benefit as available for themselves and put in as little effort as possible. Free riding becomes rampant and goodwill disappears. Socialistic societies get balkanized and fall apart in bitter internal strife. The lack of private property makes everyone unhappy except the most selfish and vicious people. When all receive according to need, most grumble that they worked harder but received less than another. Capitalism restores social peace because it produces just outcomes. It establishes direct link between effort and reward. When individuals acquire dominion over parts of creation by mixing their labor with it or by voluntary exchanges, the lazy fall into poverty and the prudent achieve success. Socialism fails because it rests on an anthropological falsehood. It naively assumes that the abolition of private property will eliminate greed. Capitalism, on the other hand, recognizes, civilizes, and channels our self-interest in a socially beneficial way. Private property, noted Aristotle, is clearly implanted in man's flawed but immutable nature. Our love of self, combined with the necessity to provide for the material needs of our families, naturally align with our desire to call part of creation our own. Aristotle was also aware that private property had been the economic foundation of all ancient civilizations. To go in the opposite direction and rebuild society on communal property would be to ignore all lessons learned by the human race through experience. The only socialistic state in his day was Sparta, and it produced nothing but war. Today we have the advantage of learning from 100 more socialist tragedies. As a product of his time, Aristotle believed that the good life is one dedicated to the pursuit of virtue. That's why his most powerful argument for the superiority of capitalism over socialism is a moral one. 22 centuries before Mill, He noted that virtue is impossible without free choices. Private property provides the opportunity to act morally. Sharing with the poor something that you can choose to keep for yourself is the only way to practice the virtue of charity. Millennials have become obsessed with the topic of privilege and discrimination, yet none of them defines their terms. When I learned English as a third language in my Bulgarian high school, I was very careful to understand the exact meaning of those foreign words. Here is a definition. Privilege is a special advantage, immunity, permission, prerogative, favor, or benefit granted to you by law or by fiat, whether as an individual or a member of a group. Most privileges and political discrimination are immoral and must be illegal. When you discriminate outside of politics, you exercise your natural right as a private property owner and your freedom to associate or not with others. I can't force you to bake me a cake. If Lady Gaga doesn't get invited to a party or a club because it's only for Bulgarians, blacks, Buddhists, bridge players, or boys under the age of 12, she has no right to demand government intervention. If a girl rejects you and marries your friend because he's younger, taller, funnier, richer, or stronger, he's not privileged. No one's rights are violated. The law must remain silent. Let me start by checking my privilege at the door. I have been blessed to live in the best country. As an outsider, I see America as one of the most diverse, inclusive, and equitable places on earth. Americans are the most tolerant, accepting, and kind people that I have ever met. I became a U.S. citizen in 2016, but I didn't need the judge to tell me I was fully American. I felt completely assimilated years before that day. I am as American as those whose ancestors came here on the Mayflower, on slave ships, or on foot from Siberia thousands of years ago. Many Bulgarians migrated to other countries, but none of them has any hopes of ever becoming German, British, or French. If you go to Western Europe as a Turkish guest worker, or as an African or Asian resident of a former colony, your children and grandchildren will remain foreigners, despite their citizenship. I wondered what makes my new home special, and why so many Americans don't appreciate how lucky they are to be born here. Some speak of our country with shame, or worse, because of past slavery. But if the theft of labor is a reason to hate America, why don't we just hate everyone? Wasn't there slavery in America before Columbus? Didn't Africans have slaves centuries before the Arabs and the Europeans started trafficking their people for profit? We all descend from horrible ancestors who engaged in warfare, pillaging, rape, slavery, and murder. Yet only the Americans live in limbo over the fact that their predecessors were not perfect. Why? I found an answer in the Declaration of Independence. With God as the source of rights, America's founders declared all men equally entitled to liberty. The failure of this young country to live up immediately to the ideals it proclaimed tortures the soul of many decent Americans and gives ammunition to our enemies. Let's not destroy the best thing because it's not perfect. Ideas produce consequences. America was a battlefield of ideas long before the Civil War. The major clash was between capitalism, the idea that you own yourself and the product of your labor, and the racial dehumanization of slavery. And America could not endure permanently half capitalist and half slave. A philosopher once noted how wild and unstable ideas have a disturbing tendency to move around and take hold. America's immune system is strong enough to withstand the frontal attack of openly Marxist and fascist viruses. That's why evil ideas have mutated here. Under names such as critical race theory, they sneak past our moral defenses to infect many good individuals. I come from a part of the world where hundreds of millions of people still mourn the victims of socialist ideas put in practice. It's disturbing to see Americans raising the red banner in the land of the free. Most students here are exposed to the influence of anti-capitalist instructors. Our academic centers spend billions of taxpayers' and donors' money to glorify socialist views and leaders in front of young adults who are still thinking mostly with their hearts. These professors don't come with horns, tails, and pitchforks. Many of them are well-educated, intelligent, and full of good intentions. "Give me just one generation of youth," wrote Lenin, "and I'll transform the whole world." For decades, socialists have been occupying an increasing number of American public and private schools and universities. Their students are now holding positions of influence in academia, the media, the entertainment industry, Wall Street, Congress, the White House, and every government agency. The left has always been good at controlling and changing the narrative. Marx was a racist globalist celebrating how European capitalism civilizes the savages in Africa and other countries. 100 years later, Marxists resisted Western imperialism and economic neocolonization. Now some of the same ideologues are back to favoring another globalization, a supranational world government. Traditional Marxism has been marginalized, but not before it had metastasized. Today's socialists appeal to new groups by redefining class struggle as a fight for race and gender equality. Their activists work hard to destroy America by splitting it into warring camps, creating artificial consciousness among our youth. Millions are led to believe that they belong to oppressed factions and that their interests stand opposed to those of rich white men. Radical socialist groups, from the Bolsheviks, the Fasci Italiani, and Sendero Luminoso, to today's Antifa and BLM, recruit support among individuals marginalized by government obstacles. The market is described as a zero-sum game, where one group can only succeed at the expense of another. Capitalism is painted as a system running on greed and exploitation. Democracy is peddled as a solution, as if voters and politicians are a more benevolent breed of humans than entrepreneurs. Socialism didn't die with the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. It's back like a zombie from a cinematic crapfest, hungry for our brains. The propaganda of failed ideas diverts our attention from the real problems, sabotaging the fight for human rights, personal freedoms, and real justice. I came to America expecting to be mocked for my accent, ethnicity, and foreign habits. Instead, I found people who cared only about my conduct. Every other country I've lived in or visited before had many of the locals treating minorities, immigrants, and even tourists with condescension, suspicion, or worse. Our university had hundreds of students from all over the world. There were just 3 professors and 1 student from the United States in my department. The rest of us were from Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, Turkey, China, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Mali, and Ecuador. Obviously, we were not selected based on first or last names. None of us was judged by the color of our skins or eyes. The only thing that mattered was the quality of our academic work. Over the years, we made friends with many American families and students from Brazil, Korea, Kenya, Nepal, Greece, Taiwan, New Zealand, Albania, Tonga, and a bunch of other places not based on appearances, but on shared interests and values. We found church families where everyone was embraced and encouraged to grow based on character, not race or nationality. My wife and I were very poor as students and lived without TV or internet in the apartment we rented. By the time I graduated, we were fully assimilated into the American culture. All thanks to living among real Americans and having little exposure to the fake American media that thrives on sowing divisions in the most inclusive country in the world. As a professor, I could finally splurge for cable service and got hooked on watching several news channels. Back in my Bulgarian high school, we studied Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. My experience had convinced me that the beautiful dream had become a reality. Now almost every TV host and politician was claiming that at least half of America was racist. I wondered if that was true. Perhaps I had lived by accident in several bubbles from the Midwest to New York City, surrounded by good people while the rest of America was full of bigots. Were all Republican presidents from Lincoln to Reagan racist? Did Bush 1 and 2 believe that whites were superior to blacks? Was racist Donald Trump's middle name? How many Americans subscribe to the view that skin color determines an individual's worth? Racism is stupid. Discriminating against employees on anything but skills and work ethic, or against customers on anything unrelated to their ability to pay, can be prohibitively costly in a competitive market. And it's not hard to see that racism is evil. But according to the mainstream media narrative, tens of millions of Americans were stupid and evil. And that's when I found the racists. It started with a debate on school choice. One side demanded vouchers for education to allow all parents, not just the wealthy ones, to decide where their children attend school. The racists fought these reforms and supported local public school monopolies. Racists don't trust minority parents to select an appropriate school for their kids. The real racists keep black children trapped in failing schools. The best social program is a job, noted Reagan. Nothing drives poverty reduction as much as access to productive work in the private sector and increasing wages resulting from improved productivity. With all the progress experienced in the American economy, why are blacks still at a disadvantage? One of the major policies restricting employment opportunities for the poor in America are government interventions in voluntary market interactions. Instead of promoting economic growth, eradicating poverty, and higher living standards, minimum wage laws erect artificial barriers for low-skilled workers to enter the labor market. Why would anyone hire less productive employees who cannot generate enough revenue, while more skilled union workers are available as substitute input? The younger and lower-skilled workers lose the chance to receive precious experience for further career development. Why would anyone support policies that reduce opportunities for the most economically vulnerable segments of the population? It's tempting to conclude that they are racist or elitist, but it's much more likely that they fall in one of two categories: the well-meaning but economically ignorant, or the well-organized and politically well-connected professional guilds. Call them the foolish and the greedy, but they are not trying to hurt the poor. Their actions have no racist intentions. Unfortunately, they produce racist consequences. Friedman explained the problem like this. There is absolutely no positive objective achieved by the minimum wage law. Its real purpose is to reduce competition for the trade unions and make it easier for them to maintain the higher wages of their privileged members. The racist effects of these restrictions is enhanced by the economic segregationism of licensing constraints in many occupations. Rather than protecting the consumer, the cost of acquiring licenses makes it all but impossible for many poor blacks to get a number of jobs. Licenses require fees, training, education, experience, or the passing of exams. These act as barriers to entry to many occupations. Like a regressive tax, they require a greater proportion of the income of the poor. A middle-income worker can afford to take the time to get training as well as the fee, while the poor often can't, which leads to fewer job opportunities and stagnant wages. In the 1950s, 1 in 20 workers needed a license. Now it's 1 in 3. More than 100 lower-income occupations are restricted by requiring costly fees and many months of training. The result is higher unemployment and reduced mobility for black Americans. Our flawed criminal justice system adds to the minimum wage and occupational licensing woes. In many states, licenses can or must be denied to those with a criminal record, including architects, barbers, referees, geologists, and dance hall operators. Poor blacks are more likely to have a criminal record. The policy makes it harder to integrate back into society, and many return to a life of crime. The clean record requirement can only be bypassed by petitioning a court, a notoriously slow and costly process. Whatever the intentions, work restrictions are counterproductive and racist. They produce more poverty and higher crime rates, harming a disproportionate number of young black males. Free speech in America is under attack. When the government itself tolerates, supports, and commits such violations of human rights, it's only free enterprise that can provide shelter for persecuted nonconformists such as Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell. If America becomes a socialist country and all universities are public, no one would hire such champions of liberty to teach. Whether you are super conservative like Ben Shapiro, mega libertarian like John Stossel, or ultra liberal but anti-woke like Bill Maher, you should thank your lucky stars that capitalism protects your First Amendment rights. Kamala Harris abused her California office to force pro-life groups to promote abortion. If we relied on such public servants to secure our unalienable rights, we'd be toast. In the past year, things turned from bad to worse when the deep state mobilized against a president who, despite his personality flaws, actually cared about the Constitution. Governors like Whitmer ruined the economy with lockdowns and, after the most irregular elections in our history, now even the private sector, decimated and intimidated, offers little protection. Welcome to Orwell's 1984. What is the most effective way to resist this creeping socialist tyranny? The first step is to understand the enemy tactics. The left has built a Trojan horse and placed it at our gates. America was tempted to bring it in because our foes have painted on it 3 words that appeal to all of us. Criticizing diversity, inclusion, and equity is like objecting to puppies, ice cream, and recess. However, just as politics turns everything it touches into crap, every good thing the left embraces gets turned into its moral opposite. Americans celebrate diversity because to us it means recognizing our individuality. The left uses the same word to play its dirty identity politics, to divide and weaken us, knowing that a house divided against itself cannot stand. We should never forget that individuals are the only kind of people there are. That kind of diversity is non-negotiable for the preservation of a free, peaceful, just, and thriving society. America is the most inclusive place under the sun because we embrace free markets and private enterprise, a system that rewards you for serving your fellow man. Political attempts to help, like minimum wages, subsidies, bailouts, healthcare and public school monopolies, licensing restrictions, zoning, and welfare handouts, typically result in exclusion. Capitalism is incompatible with slavery. Private property rights rest on the self-evident truth that you and I have no human masters and deserve to be in control of the fruits of our labor. Markets punish discrimination better than laws, yet ideologues calling themselves anti-racist declare that capitalism and racism will ultimately die together. Abolishing capitalism will restore and universalize slavery. Finally, the American concept of equity is equality under the rule of law. We bow to no one, and we call those who serve our food at McDonald's, sir. Meanwhile, the left pursues the mirage of social justice. This un-American concept erodes individual character and social harmony. Only a free enterprise system secures equal dignity for all and equal opportunity for our flourishing.
What is justice? Our well-being depends on social cooperation. Cooperation requires the consent of the individuals. Consent is impossible without a mechanism that secures our rights. The virtue behind this mechanism is called justice. Justice, explains Thomas Aquinas, is rendering to each one his right. Justice is the cement that holds us together into what we call society. Without it, Hume notes, we will fall into a savage and solitary condition. What is social justice? A United Nations report claims that justice is in the outcomes and must be judged based on economic inequalities. We are pushed to accept as a fact that only coercive government acts of taking from the rich to give to the poor can rectify all perceived injustices. The arguments of the self-proclaimed champions for social justice must be exposed as impractical, immoral, and absurd. Why is social justice impractical? In his book Free to Choose, Milton Friedman argues that acts of aggression against someone's property, such as taxation of wealth and income, for the purpose of achieving more equitable outcomes destroys freedom. Social utilitarians may be willing to accept the sacrifice of individual freedom for the common good, but even they have to concede that our war on poverty has been a disaster, diminishing the incentives of the poor to get on the path of prosperity by receiving good education, working full-time, and forming stable families. Why is social justice immoral? Robert Nozick makes an even stronger case against using redistributive policies to achieve just outcomes. In his Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick points out that government confiscation of the fruits of your labor is on par with forced labor. Locke, whose ideological impact on the founding of the American Republic is second only to the Bible, notes that every man has a property in his own person, so that the work of his hands are properly his. Tracing private property rights to the principle of self-ownership declares forced redistribution immoral. Why is social justice absurd? Finally, Hayek makes an argument against the very notion of social justice. On the one hand, we have outcomes resulting from human design and central planning that could be unjust based on the arbitrary decisions of specific persons in charge of allocating the goods. On the other hand, we have the spontaneous order of the market, in which the distribution of wealth is a product of countless voluntary individual transactions. To the extent that none of those choices is unjust, demanding justice from such a process is clearly absurd. Feelings versus results. Capitalism is often disparaged for running on greed. It should be glorified for unleashing the entrepreneurial potential of ordinary men and women, thus saving billions from abject poverty. The left supports public policies if they feel good. The right cares if they produce good results. That's the main reason why the so-called progressives favor social justice, and why conservatives support free market capitalism as a humane system that lifts the poor up while securing freedom and justice for all. Charity versus redistribution. Christians are often tempted by the false doctrine of social justice. Jesus tells his followers that whatever they do for the poor, they do for God's glory in response to receiving salvation. There's a big difference, however, between voluntary charity and coercive redistribution. While it may be praiseworthy to give to those in need, delegating such duties to secular political authorities who can only fund them by using force, such as taxation, is anti-Christian, unjust, and immoral. Justice is impartial and historical. Lady Justice wears a blindfold for a reason. Real justice is impartial and objective. It is not a respecter of persons. It cannot show favoritism to the rich or the poor, the men or the women, the white or the black. There is no such thing as economic, gender, or racial justice. Justice cannot intervene on behalf of one group at the expense of another. Social justice is at its best a meaningless expression. Real justice is historical, concerned with the actions of real individuals and not with the outcomes of their voluntary interactions. Social justice threatens civilization and liberty. Justice doesn't need qualifiers such as social. A castaway needs no justice. He is in no danger of having his rights violated by another man. In that sense, all justice is social, related to our social interactions. Social justice, as understood today, however, is all about redistribution of wealth. It advocates for the violation of property rights. Thus, social justice is the antithesis of real justice, a force for decivilization and a threat to prosperity. Social justice is irreconcilable with freedom. Capitalism is the way to freedom, justice, and prosperity. We all desire freedom and prefer to see the poor prosper. The social justice movement has the same goals. Tragically, by putting equality above freedom, they use means that are not only unjust, but counterproductive. Friedman notes, a society that puts freedom first will end up with both greater freedom and greater equality. If we care for the poor and love justice, we must preserve and defend capitalism.
The so-called anti-racist policies have racist consequences. Take affirmative action and diversity quotas. Leftists claim that, because of historical discrimination, blacks are at a competitive disadvantage, so standards must be lowered for them. My wife had a black professor who denounced affirmative action as harmful and insulting. She noted that millions of blacks like her have proven that they can compete without the benefits of lower standards. Affirmative action was casting doubts in the minds of colleagues and students on how she achieved her success. The policy was intended to help blacks, but lower admission standards set up many of these students for failure. They get placed in schools for which they are not prepared. The result is high black dropout rates. Race and ethnicity do not determine whether we succeed or fail as students or professionals. We must value individuals for their unique qualities, experiences, ambitions, and achievements. Are these racist claims? Or is it more racist to insist that minorities are not as capable as whites and therefore need affirmative action? One of the most twisted ideas on the left is to treat everyone as a member of a caste. Apparently, the value of your views must be evaluated relative to your place in the hierarchy of something called intersectionality. This idiotic taxonomy takes into account how many victim groups you belong to. Initially, I discarded the term as just another millennialist fad. Then I recognized it as an echo from my socialist past. I grew up under a government awarding points of merit or demerit based on your family status of victimhood or privilege. Those were added to the points you earn on the entry exams for high schools and universities. Intersectionality affected everyone's professional and personal life behind the Iron Curtain. In 7th grade, I took the high school qualifying exams. The scores were posted publicly. I got in, but noticed kids with a C ranked above those with a B. Why? Their mom was a factory worker, or, even better, their grandpa helped the Red Army to occupy Bulgaria. Alas, my parents were professors, and my grandparents never liked Stalin. Today you get points as a woman for being oppressed by the patriarchy. You get a bonus for being gay and oppressed by the heterosexual majority. All blacks have another victim status. I had no privilege then, and I'm sadly at the bottom of the totem pole now, a straight white male. The term intersectionality was coined by some professor to create alliances to fight the oppressor, me. Academics are entitled to all sorts of absurd ideas. Thankfully, people with common sense are not obliged to follow. Socialists are free to spin their theories in their ivory towers. You and I are free to expose them as gibberish. Both are evidence that America is the most diverse and inclusive place on earth. We should continue to judge individuals on character, not anatomy. For as long as the vast majority in America rejects intersectionality and anti-racism, we can preserve our great nation under God with liberty and justice for all.
Let me tell you how my story ends. I become a tenured, award-winning professor of political science at an Ivy League university and then at one of the leading universities in the South. Now let me tell you how my story begins. I grew up in rural Virginia, literally dirt poor. I dropped out of school in the 8th grade and had 3 children by the time I'm 20. I consider myself to be a reasonably modest person, but even I have to admit that's quite a journey. How did I do it? I worked hard, not crazy 24/7 hard, just hard. I made good decisions, not brilliant three-dimensional chess decisions, just good ones. I met people along the way who helped me and sincerely wanted to see me succeed. Not because they had something to gain, but because they were decent people. Almost all of these individuals, by the way, were white. But mostly, I think I was blessed in one crucial way. I was born in America, a true land of opportunity for anyone of any color or background. In this country, where you start your life does not determine where you end up. That works in both directions, by the way. You can start out with every advantage and waste them all. Or you can start out with nothing and become a success. It all depends on you. Your attitude is far more important than your race, gender, or social class in determining what you will accomplish in life. When I hear young blacks, or anyone for that matter, talk about systemic racism, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I want to laugh because it's such nonsense. I want to cry because I know it's pushing untold numbers of young blacks into a dead end of self-pity and despair. Instead of seizing the amazing opportunities America offers them, they seize an excuse to explain why they're not succeeding. I was born into a world where systemic racism was real. No fooling, outright bigotry, back of the bus real. But here's what you need to know. Yes, that racism shaped the black experience, but even then, it did not define it. Change was in the air. Call it systemic reform. The modern civil rights movement was in its infancy, and the leaders who fought for equal rights for blacks were men and women of all races. They believed in America and were determined to see it live up to its highest ideals manifest in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Did I know growing up that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? I don't think I ever thought about it. If I did, I'd like to think that I would have had enough common sense to know that we can't judge men who lived 250 years ago by the moral standards of our own day. But I know that Jefferson wrote the words in the Declaration of Independence that made slavery ultimately impossible, that all men are created equal. And I know that Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, and Adams and the rest of the founders risked everything to make my world, my America, possible. How could I not be grateful for that and for the sacrifices so many others have made to preserve it? The truth is, I cannot remember a time when I did not love America and feel pride in the belief that I live in the greatest country in the world. I knew if I diligently pursued my ambitions, I could leave the poverty of my early years with all its abuse and depression behind me. I was fortunate in another way. I was spared the life-sapping, negative messages about America that are crippling a generation of young people. These ideas are poison: white privilege, whiteness as a form of property, unconscious racism, reparations, microaggressions, police have it out for blacks, that the United States was created to protect and promote slavery. These are the ideas young people are told they must accept, and then they're told to reject the ideas that can save them, the antidote, the success principles that enabled me and millions of other Americans to escape lives of poverty. These principles aren't complicated. Work hard, learn from your mistakes, take personal responsibility for your actions. When I made the decisions to get my high school equivalency, attend a community college, and then earn 4 additional college and university degrees, I believed that my education would open doors. And it did. It was only when exposed to academic theories of oppression in graduate school that I was informed that because I was black, poor, and female, I could never do what I had already accomplished. Thank God it was too late for these toxic messages to stop me. Don't let them stop you. I'm Carol Swain, host of Be the People podcast and retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Welcome, Alex.
Greetings from Bulgaria. Again.
Well, thank you for being here, and I want to remind our participants to use the Q&A box on the right. Alex, I don't know if you want to moderate your own questions. I've been moderating these for our other presenters, but I think you're fairly familiar with the system.
Yeah, I'm checking the Q&A. I don't see anything posted yet.
Okay. I often start out with a question of my own. So I want to start out with this question. You were in Bulgaria. I think you studied Marxist theory, correct?
I was a Marxist. I grew up before 1989, and I was a passionate communist. So I know it from the inside. I've lived it. I believed it. I kept an open mind when things started to change and allowed facts and reasoning to change me.
Yeah, that sounds like what Thomas Sowell was saying in his video.
Precisely. I find so many former Marxists that have stories so much similar to mine, even if they haven't lived in a communist country under socialism, but their stories are always similar in a way. Oh, I see something from Griffin. Oh, okay, yeah.
I just want to follow up on that before we get to your first question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you say that there were facts that changed your mind, and I would like to know, since Sowell didn't elaborate, what do you mean by facts?
Some of the early facts that surfaced in the few weeks right after the Berlin Wall fell and our dictator was ousted in November of 1989 was about the way that socialism was implemented. I thought that it was capitalism that was forced upon the people, that they were kept without a choice, that the government used police and the army to suppress their desire for freedom of expression. And I found out that socialism did not come as a liberation. We were taught in high school that the Red Army came to free us from fascism, from Nazi Germany. Of course, we were allies with Germany in the First and the Second World War. But then we had a new government that declared independence. And actually, a few days before the Soviet army came, we were already at war with Germany. We had declared war on Germany. The Soviet Union, the Red Army, was at war with Germany, and they invaded us only because Stalin wanted to expand the influence of the Soviet Union in Europe. And so I learned the real facts of the history of my country, the most recent part of it. And I found out that the Red Army came and plundered us and enslaved us instead of liberating us, and that people like my grandparents actually suffered. My parents never told me that my grandfather had died hiding from the Russians. He was a White Army officer. That my other grandfather was sought by the police and had to escape. And that my grandmother was taken out of her school in Sofia and sent to teach in a village outside of the capital. That so many people were imprisoned for their beliefs, even if they were not in any way associated with the regime before the communists came, even if they were only intellectuals that were seen as part of the system. They were taken to labor camps, tortured, some of them died. during those years of imprisonment, things that I never knew. I knew about the Holocaust in Germany. I knew about the Nazi killing Jews, but I never knew that the communists had killed many more people. I never knew about the Holodomor, the way that Stalin murdered millions of Ukrainian people. I had never heard of the starvation of the Chinese people. My father used to tell me about the fact that some stupid things were done under Mao when they were shooting the sparrows, and supposedly that caused too many insects to eat the rice, and they had problem with the food supply. But then I found out it was collectivization of land that lowered the incentives and that produced starvation during the great so-called Great Leap Forward, and tens of millions of Chinese people died. Things that
Alex, I'm going to stop you
heard.
because I have a feeling that if I don't stop you, you can go on and on. But I trust you that it shows the importance of education. And you used a quote by Lenin in one of your videos, "Give me a generation."
Yeah.
And the danger of what's happening in our public education, there are things that some people might call propaganda now, which are revolutionary in intent, really. So I'm going to move to I'm ask you to move to our Q&A section here and moderate your own questions. There are 3 waiting for you.
Okay. I see Griffin Decker on my screen. Professor Tokarev, what is your response to the Nordic countries that practice socialist capitalism? They tend to be the shining image of socialism with great success and happiness. I have no idea what socialist capitalism is. These are countries that became very successful after the Second World War, partly because for example, Sweden was never engaged in any major wars, maybe for the past almost 300 years, or maybe more than that. They were in the 30-year war, as far as I remember, and then I'm not sure if they ever fought. And not fighting a war is a great advantage already in itself. But Sweden experienced its great economic success in the early 20th, and right after the Second World War, the country accumulated a lot of wealth, a lot of potential when it was a free market capitalist system. And it remained a capitalist system and is still a capitalist system. There is no socialist country in Europe at this point of time, none whatsoever. When people here in America point a finger to Scandinavia and say socialism, what they mean is that they have high tax rates, that they have a lot of redistribution. But in some ways, some of these countries have a higher degree of economic freedom. That means they're more capitalist than the United States themselves. Before Trump's corporate tax cuts, those Scandinavian countries were taxing their corporations at a lower rate. They were more pro-business, more capitalist, and that is what made these countries succeed. So the extent to which they succeeded was due to their capitalist system. And the fact that they slowed down, and that Sweden, for example, fell down from number 4 in the world to number 14, was due to the fact that their people kept electing social democratic governments. For a considerable period of time, they had these policies that drained the incentive out of the people in Sweden, and they started complaining. These young people are now the sickest generation ever. They claim that they have so many disabilities and they take so many sick days because there is no limit to that. And it's like what's happening in the United States right now. They pay people not to work more than what they can earn by being productive. So who's going to work? People poor or rich, they're not stupid. I mean, they're going to respond to the incentives like everybody else. And so Scandinavians had a lot of economic freedom, a lot of capitalism. That kind of environment created the incentives for them to succeed. The moment they started electing governments that started redistributing from the people who work harder and smarter to those who don't do so, did we lose the connection, Dale? I don't see you on the screen. Okay, I'll keep talking.
I'm here, Alex, and I will join you at the end.
Okay, in the hope that we can still hear each other. So to the extent that they move to a system that is now penalizing the more productive and rewarding sloth, those countries have started to decline relative, not in an absolute sense, but relatively to what they used to be. They are worse off. I should say, Griffin, just shoot me an email. I'll send you a great video by Molino that is discussing the Nordic model and several others. Of course, I've written a few things on that topic myself. Okay, let me check. There are other questions. I need to find them. Okay, after Griffin, I see Callista Shannon posted something. Hi, Professor Tokarev. Thank you for the well-presented video. Could you please comment on the government's financial reaction to COVID-19 and the lasting impacts that this will have on the economy? I actually talked about it a year ago, once again from Bulgaria in a pre-recorded video. So Callista, shoot me an email and I will send you the link to that one. It's a total disaster, the way that, and I briefly talked about the way that we are trying to help people by sending them money for being unemployed. And while it may have been justified to a certain extent, if we assume that the government has this kind of legitimate function to play in our society, that people who were laid off during the early months of this crisis, that they may have benefited in a certain way from the government checks that they received. But sending this to everyone, I received once at least, maybe twice. Yeah, I think twice already money. And I believe that they owe me still something. I don't know. I haven't been checking much, but why was I subsidized by my grandchildren in a situation in which Northwood University never stopped? We kept teaching. We had a very brief window during which we moved online, and then around Thanksgiving, again, for the last couple of weeks of the fall semester, we had to continue with real-time online connections. But why was I being paid when I never lost anything during the pandemic? And one thing I should tell you, the most important perhaps point here, Callista, is that money is not wealth. The money that I get from the government, and I'm not getting it from the government, of course, the government has no money to give me. They print new money. In a way, they borrow from my grandchildren, as I pointed out. That money is not wealth. If we all get $1 million in the form of checks or digits in our bank accounts through government intervention, that doesn't make us wealthy. The only thing that can make us wealthy is if we are more productive, if we produce more wealth. And what we did last year was the worst thing that we could have done. We prevented people under penalty of law to work. We destroyed our economy and then thought that we can make up for the loss of real wealth, the goods and services that were not produced, with cash. How is that going to work? There is no magic wand that can turn my dollars into goods and services. Real people will have to exert real effort. They have to go to work and serve each other. This is what the economy does. This is how we become wealthy. Money doesn't mean we are more wealthy. More money just doesn't create wealth. It fuels inflation. And of course, for the younger generations, that is going to somehow come as a bill. One way or another, it will have to be covered. Sooner or later, we are going to pay a very steep price for that. Jen O'Grady has a question. Professor Tokarev, I would like to thank you for your presentation. You did an excellent job of explaining these different groups' meaning. Appreciate the humor as well. I hope we are able to have access to your presentation. I don't have a question here, but thank you, Jen. And again, if you shoot me an email, I would love to send you the whole presentation again. And my presentation from last year on the horrible response of mostly democratic governors across the United States during the early phase of the pandemic. But even if you ignore that, I don't see any reason to continue to try to stimulate the economy that is recovering already, despite the horrible damage done by people like Whitmer and Newsom and Cuomo.
Alex, unfortunately, we are out of time and out of questions, I suppose. I want to tell Jennifer and everybody else that's enrolled in our Freedom Seminar for Credit that I will post Alex's presentation in your Blackboard course shells, so you can access it there, and the COVID one as well. So Alex, as always.
And I'd love to answer more questions if you guys just email me, Tokarev A, my first name Alex, Tokareva at northwood.edu. Just send me as many questions, and I'd love to answer tomorrow.
Alex, let me propose something different.
Okay.
I'm going to invite you to join our Yellow Dig discussion board.
Okay.
You will see a topic there called Alex Tokarev.
Okay.
And you go to that topic, and if people have posted questions for you, you can discuss with them right there on our discussion board to your heart's content. I know you will do this because I know you love to engage our students.
Absolutely. Just give me a few hours to try to sleep. I mean, I'm still jet lagged. I don't know if it's day or night. It's already dark here.
I'm guessing that it's going to be a while before our students post as well. They've got to get through the rest of this presentation this afternoon. So you're good to sleep, Alex.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to present again.